needs space, and that's exactly what this training center is going to offer.
First at 6, a new deal between the city of Atlanta and DeKalb County will now allow construction to begin at the highly contested Atlanta Public Training Safety Center.
So this agreement is coming after an 11-month review by DeKalb County's environmental authorities and engineers. We have team coverage for you tonight. 11 Alive's Joe Ripley is speaking to protesters about what's next in this fight to save the forest.
Hey, good evening to you. Protesters standing inside and outside of City Hall voicing their frustration and opposition to this public safety training facility. Now, they say this will have a direct negative impact on working class families and people of color in that area. Protesters today holding up signs reading, quote, "Stop Cop City." That is the name protesters have given to this facility. Other signs reading, "Defend Atlanta Forests," abolish police rather, and "Blood on Your Hands," referencing the deadly shooting of protester Manuel Esteban Paez-Terán less than 2 weeks ago. Protesters said their top concerns remain the destruction of the environment, plus their belief that the facility promotes aggressive police tactics. That is in their words. Timothy Corey today saying he still feels optimistic, though, despite what he heard today from city leaders.
Someone was killed in that forest protesting this monstrosity. And the fact that now they're trying to acknowledge the movement in this backdoor sham compromise just shows how strong the movement is now. We're only getting stronger.
And tonight, protesters tell me they will keep at it, keep demonstrating until this project is canceled altogether. But as we learned earlier today, the city of Atlanta, as well as DeKalb County city leaders, they say this project is going to continue to move forward, saying they've listened to sound environmental research and they absolutely need a training facility for police and fire crews to be properly trained.
Good evening and welcome to Black Voters Matter, first policy corner of 2023 during the last full week of Black History Month. Tonight, we will discuss the evolution of paramilitary-style policing with we will also highlight Atlanta's troubling Cop City plans in the process despite the public outcry and disapproval. I'm your resident bad and nerdy host for the evening. I'm currently the National Policy Manager for Black Voters Matter Fund. The Policy Corner, as always, is a safe space for our righteous outrage and where policy meets power and action. To be clear, we are not your average, ordinary, boring policy think tank. We bring policy and Black people into one place and one space, and we keep it 100 while we do it. Translation, we bring the seasoning and the sauce to bland policy discussions. Policy Corner, we center collaboration and power building while shifting counterproductive narratives and drive Black and other marginalized communities forward and fight against discriminatory policies and uplifts transformational change and Black and marginalized communities. Sorry, you guys, I can't talk tonight. To provide a little bit more historical context about the subject matter tonight, i.e. Cop City. Most of you listening tonight are well aware of the history of policing in our communities. The current state of policing has taken on this paramilitary style format. Obviously, this is not new. Dates even further back than the Rodney King beatings. William H. Parker was an infamous LAPD police chief who intentionally hired ex-military and white supremacists to fill his ranks in the 50s and 60s. So this is not new. I would say Cop City is the latest evolution in the over-policing of our communities. So just a little bit of context around Cop City. Back in 2021 in September, the Atlanta City Council passed a massive $90 million police training facility on about, I believe, over 300 acres of land. The proposed land is in a majority Black area of DeKalb County, which is already an over-policed part of Georgia. The training facility has widely been unpopular with Atlanta residents. They voted against it while the city went on with the project anyway. Cobb City has significant backing from the Atlanta Police Foundation and many of Atlanta's most prominent corporations. Surprise, surprise. Some of those corporations are also backing much of the voter suppression going on in states like Georgia over the last 2 to 3 years. So, as of January 31st, Mayor Andre Dickens and the DeKalb County senior leadership announced the Cobb City permits have been approved to begin destruction of the forest. The criminalization of protesters and outsourcing of the training facility to the Israeli Defense Force is another troubling and deeply disturbing aspect of Cobb City. So I wanted to introduce our legal director, April Albright, and then we will move forward with the introduction of Kamau Franklin, the leader of the work happening in Atlanta, Georgia at Community Movement Builders.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad that you are joining, and sorry for the hiccup. We normally start, but we had some technical difficulties tonight, but we're really glad that we were still able to come on and have this very important discussion. But, with Black Voters Matter, we don't have discussions in isolation just amongst ourselves. We consider ourselves to be strategic partners with people who are doing real work, real time, transforming, our community, the Black community, and even other marginalized communities impacted by so many issues like what we're going to discuss tonight. And folks have been hearing about Cobb City, right? But there are so many faces. And Kamau Franklin is one of those faces, one of those voices organizing around this very important issue that's happening in the city of Atlanta right now and all of its surrounding counties. And so, I have the honor of introducing him because I have known him for many, many years. Like, Kamau Franklin, he's not new to this. He's very true to this, specifically around the issue of policing and police terror in Black communities. And for over 30 something years, through the Malcolm X grassroots movement, now through his own organization that he birthed and founded, Community Movement Builders, focusing on the issues that matter to our community to stop the terror. So he's been focusing on that. He's been focusing on gentrification in our community. He's been focusing on strengthening Black communities. When other issues of police terror has happened, in the city of Atlanta, his organization has been front and center to ensure that our people's voices are heard, and that not just voices, but that real policy happens, not from the city council chambers and not from the government, but from the community's perspective. He has also, been the part of creating cop watches in New York City, where, he was originally living before he moved here. And one of my favorite parts about him is that he is the husband to one of my closest friends, and he is the father of 2 wonderful children, in light of all of the other powerful things that he does. And so we wanted his voice to be heard tonight, not because he is the only voice dealing with this, but he is one of the voices that is lending its platform to even other voices, to empower them to also fight against the Cobb City that they're trying to create in the city of Atlanta. And we know that what they're doing here, they'll try to create in other places. And so without further ado, we want to bring him on so that we can, begin our discussion tonight. And he can give us some insight and tell us how we can help bring not only awareness to this issue, because we know what they're doing. We know that the mainstream and the powers that be are trying to characterize this in a way, right, that will keep us from understanding what's really going on. So we wanted to bring him on so that he can bring true awareness to what's going on. And he can also tell us what we can do to bring support and keep this movement going forward until we can find the kind of solutions that we need, not only for Cobb City, but for this issue of police terror that we're under in this country. So without that, further ado, Kamau, welcome to the Policy Corner.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we just want to talk, because a lot of people didn't even know this was going on. We knew it was going on in the city of Atlanta and in some activist circles, but not a lot of folks knew it was going on until, the unfortunate death of a young brother, right, who was a part of the movement. And then once it happened, it just grew and it became we're terrorists and became we're cop killers. But there was so many things that were going on even before this happened. And so we want to start off by just giving you a space to just kind of talk about those befores, right? And we want to talk about the tragic event that happened, but we want to start off talking about what was happening before. Like, how did we even get to the point, right, where they want to take over 300 acres and committed to creating a even more hostile, right, police force in a Black city? So, we just want to kind of, if you could just kind of break it down and just get us started understanding that history.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, the idea of Cop City, a couple of the important organizations that were mentioned, the Atlanta Police Foundation. The idea of Cop City is something that was birthed from the Atlanta Police Foundation, probably in 2017 or 2018. But they weren't plans that they were acting on or moving on until after the 2020 uprisings. And as folks know, the 2020 uprisings, when George Floyd was killed, Breonna Taylor was killed here in Atlanta, Rashard Brooks was killed at a Wendy's. And it was during that time when the uprisings took place in response to these police murders all around the country and here in Atlanta in particular. It was after that Atlanta felt both its political elite, its Black political elite, and its white economic elite felt that the conversation needed to be shifted, one, and two, that Atlanta was not ready to stop movements and uprisings from happening. And so part of the plan for releasing the idea of Cop City in 2020, after the 2020 uprisings, as stated herself, the mayor at the time, Keisha Lance Bottoms, was that it was supposed to be a morale boost for the police, right? Those are her words, not mine. In addition to that, the idea was that we needed to, we being the city again, the corporate powers that are funding this, the Atlanta Police Foundation, is that they felt they needed to have more centralized training for crowd control and for organizing control. They felt they needed to build out this militarized base for to have the space and room for that to happen. And in addition, the ordinary run-of-the-mill over-policing, continued over-policing of our communities. As we know, 90% of the arrests that happen in Fulton County, the county that Atlanta is mostly in, is Black people still, even though under the mayorships of Black leaders for the last 50 years, the population of Atlanta, the so-called Black Mecca, has gone from 60% Black to less than 50% Black. So so this idea came as a way to fight back against movements. And when organizers and activists heard about it, we started doing organizing right away on it, right? So the traditional type of organizing that we've all engaged in, rallies, demonstrations, town hall meetings, call-ins, canvassing, anything that we could do to persuade the city council and the mayor to not go forward with this. At the time of its release, all 16 members of the city council were firmly behind this project. They thought they were going to be able to put this project through, that there would be no public dissent. They didn't plan any town halls themselves, even though it was required, until organizers and activists forced them to do so. And when they did do one, they didn't allow questions from the audience. They just took questions on cards and they themselves decided which questions would be answered. So we knew the fix was in from the very beginning. And even knowing that, we still did all the protest and organizing that is needed to stop something like this. The city council decided to vote for it, and they thought then that would be the end of this. But instead, the organizing and activism shifted, and it shifted to what people became sort of familiar with as the forest defenders.
Right.
So the strategy became, folks who are organizing against it started moving and going in the forest. Now, to be honest, right, that's not something Black folks going to do, right? These Black folks is not going to move in mass to no forest. We all know that, right? But these young kids, mostly not exclusively white by any stretch of the imagination. I don't want to paint them as exclusively, but mostly white young folks who had anarchist politics or had autonomous politics. They decided that they would take the struggle, continue the struggle, and take it to the forest and start moving in and doing civil disobedience actions in the forest. And because that happened, it kept the struggle alive. So people have to realize that it was something that was a new tactic. We always talked about the forest, but of course, an organization like ours emphasized the over-policing that was going to happen through the building of Cop City. We emphasized the militarization of the police through the building of Cop City. We knew that, again, the building of Cop City meant that it was going to be targeting movements in activism and organizing against police violence.
Mhm.
But the new aspect also of bringing in and talking about the dimensions of cutting down over 100 acres of forests
Come
to
on.
build
Mhm.
Cop City was something that was needed in terms of the environmental racism. As stated in the piece earlier, the community that is adjacent to this forest is 70% Black and working class. Surveys have shown that 90% of the community is against the building of Cop City. This community was promised access to that forest for park space, for playgrounds, for hiking trails. It was supposed to be part of the ecosphere of that particular community. And climate-wise, that is a community that is prone to flooding. And so that forest, for whatever it was worth for that community, also prevented more disastrous flooding from happening. The city ripped up those plans. Basically, they broke their treaty, their agreement. And
All
the
right.
history of the forest is that that forest was once the place where the Muskogee Nation, the Muskogee Indian Nation, inhabited, and that land was stolen from them. And on
Mm.
that land was put a plantation where
Mm.
African slaves were held. On that land was a prison, and where folks who were mostly Black had to do labor there in that prison. On that land is a youth prison that is still there today, and the
Mhm.
police continue to practice firearm training in that land today. And so all of that was part of the early organizing and activism, even during the times when we were out there protesting. We
Yeah.
had dozens of arrests that took place that, again, weren't really reported in media, or they're reported as protester violence as opposed to police violence against protesters.
Come
These
on.
protesters who were arrested for being on the sidewalk, obstruction of governmental administration, resisting arrest, standard arrests at that particular time. But yet these protests were basically protests on sidewalks. And because this movement continued on is when these tactics started to step up. And I'll start to conclude with this part about some of the early stages. We started to get Freedom of Information Act reports that showed at a retreat by the Atlanta Police Foundation that there was a task force that was developed. This is a task force of the Atlanta Police, the DeKalb County Police, DeKalb County prosecutorial offices, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Homeland Security. That this task force was beginning to think through about the strategy of using domestic terrorism charges, state level domestic terrorism charges against protesters in the forest. And so
Mm.
basically a collusion of the Democratic, Black, moderate, liberal city government with the right wing, white, racist governor of Georgia with the moderate federal government, Democratic federal government of the United States.
Mm.
All took place in this task force to protect the interests of the police. And in December, in one of their raids in the forest, they arrested approximately 6 organizers or forest defenders, and they were the first ones charged with domestic terrorism. In January, they went back January 18th and arrested an additional 6, and then that was the killing of Tortuguita, the young organizer, forest defender who was killed that day. And then later on at a street protest, another 7 were arrested and charged with domestic terrorism. So we have 19 organizers and activists who've been charged with it. Out of these unfortunate circumstances has been the uplifting of this movement around Cop City, which has allowed it to get national and international media attention and to really start making it something that folks can now hear about, talk about, and hopefully get more involved in, because they can now understand the ramifications of having the first eco activist killed in the United States,
Wow. Yeah.
and understanding the ramifications of building out this militarized center that will involve training, again, to stop our movements and to over police our communities. And I'll stop there.
Mm.
Kamau, could you elaborate? Well, let me go back. So, all of us on this discussion tonight are aware of when something happens involving activists, regular people, Black people, brown people, and their interactions with law enforcement, there's this character assassination that happens, right? The media eats it up, right? So how can we, my first question, how can we keep Manuel's name lifted, but also the work he was actually doing and the other activists still working to stop Cop City, that kind of shifts that narrative away from these character assassinations that are common. And then two, is this something, given what I've seen on a legislative standpoint, I'm seeing all these anti-protest bills. I'm seeing a lot of these anti-democratic laws being put into place to prevent activists from utilizing their right towards civil disobedience, with the full support of many in state government claiming public safety. Do you see this as a trend happening in other major cities with deeply entrenched Black and Brown communities?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. So the direct answer is yes, right? And I think ever since the original or the starting of the uprisings, which have been dubbed sort of Black Lives Matter, the response to it by both city and state agencies, even at the height of it, when the conversation began to be around defunding the police or abolishing the police or finding alternatives to public safety, even when those conversations started to get some light and media attention, it was in the background that the policy planners were already planning their responses, right? And part of their responses were just what you were saying. How do we make it more difficult for protesters to express their so-called First Amendment rights? How do we do that through legislative action? And so to have these domestic terrorism charges for the first time that they are ever applied be on organizers and activists who are protesting police violence speaks volume of what the role of the state is in terms of trying to control movements and organizing. And we've had other places in other cities where maybe not these same charges, but similar charges or similar ways in which they're trying to have civil penalties against organizers to be responsible for their so-called property damage, the heightened criminal charges against protesters and activists. And so the response has been that, you know, on its face, that people will make polite talk or say things like they want to support Black lives. These same corporations who give all of our organizations money will claim to want to support Black lives, are the same organizations behind our backs funding this center to the tune of $60 million of the $90 million that it's scheduled to be used for. As it comes to the young organizer Tortuguita, we were immediately suspicious of the narrative. We knew that in police killings over and over again, and April knows this from being a practicing attorney, for me back in the day being a practicing attorney, the first story that the police put out is usually their first grounding in their lies, right? It is the first statement for them to try to make the narrative what they say the narrative is. And usually the corporate media, as we dub them, the local media, in a lot of cases, they run with that narrative. If it's the official version, then it's ran as the truth. And so we tried to make sure early on that we were questioning that narrative, the narrative that a lone organizer or someone sitting in a tent, this, again, surrounded by multiple police agencies with heavy firearms, decided to fire one single bullet out of a tent, only to be met with a blast of gunfire. Remember, he was shot 13 times minimally. So like they can't even identify. They said he may have been shot more times, but they could not identify how many more it could be. So they stopped at saying at a minimum he was shot 13 times, right? That this organizer and activist, and from reports that we got from people in and around the forest, and even from the videotapes that were later released, it wasn't a single shot, a slight pause, and then a return to fire. It was a blast of fire.
So
And as the police themselves say in the video, suppressed fire, which is their terminology for police fire, right? Yeah. The fact that the Atlanta Police Department, which is required to have on body cams, all of a sudden, in this particular instance, there is no body cam footage of them at the scene at the time of the gunfire. It's extremely suspicious to us and speaks of a criminality by the police to cover up what really took place in that forest.
That's right.
So part of our call has been an independent investigation. And we knew right away, as the organizers in the background, that we had to make sure that people knew who Tortuguita was as a young organizer and activist, that their relationship in terms of past organizing and activism, their relationship to their family members, who they were, so that narrative could not be captured by the police, who decided to drip information to make the assumption that this young person was guilty of a crime or shot at them first, and then there was return fire. We didn't believe that based on, again, the police versions of events that kind of come out. And to be honest, even through our own history of being radical organizers and knowing the fate of political prisoners, people who have been in organizations that people like April and I have supported and been a part of, like the stories of the police, even in circumstances of COINTELPRO, of police and federal agencies, are constantly told, the people are told lies to justify the actions by these agencies.
That's right. And there were, like you named how many, there were other activists, right? You know, he was tragically unalive, but there were other activists who to this day, right, are still facing domestic terrorism charges.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there may be some, I'm not sure, that may also not be given bond, or maybe
there's several that are not giving bond because of their prior participation in actions and or having priors. And so they were denied bond, but approximately 14 or 15 have been given bond. And through the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, donations have been made to them. They have been bonded out and lawyers have been secured for them.
And can people continue to support them that way?
Yes, yeah. So we recommend, in terms of directly supporting those who were arrested, that the Atlanta Solidarity Fund is the place for folks to go and to give support resources, because that is the tool that's been used in Atlanta for a while now. For any organizer or activist that's arrested, no matter what the circumstances, there's no judging of the circumstances. There's no good activists versus bad activists, right? The Atlanta elite likes to tout that, you know, good trouble is supposed to be something that it supports. But if you do civil disobedience and direct action in Atlanta, you could be charged with domestic terrorism. So I want to be clear that the people arrested in the forest in particular were arrested in tree huts and in tents. They were not, at the time of their arrest, involved in any activity that could be even close to be considered something of the nature of domestic terrorism, or something that was even in nature of destruction of property. None of that was happening at the time of the arrest, and there's no footage and or information that the police have that could even tie them to even past actions of anything around direct action tactics that involved stopping the police or stopping the trucks or whatever from entering the forest. These are purely political charges meant to scare the movement and scare organizers and activists from participating in stopping Cop City.
And it's amazing. I think you were really clear that this is happening under the watch of a Black mayor, of a predominantly Black city council that was in collusion, right, with the white Republican governor, but also supported, right, by a larger Democratic, you know, framework. Why are we, you know, why are we supporting this? Like, why would, you know, what is your, you know, belief as to why this would happen here, you know, in Atlanta?
Well, I think it goes, I mean, historically speaking, I think the Black elite, particularly the Black political elite, you know, since the times, let's say, where folks were tied to the struggles of the 60s and 70s, the Black political elite has broken off from having let's say, an interest in serving the interests of working class and poor Black people and or the Black struggle, right? It's become clear that the Black political elite are careerists, and they've made their ties to the white economic elite here in Atlanta. And so that's always been, obviously, the particular history here of Atlanta is that even though it's dubbed the cradle of the civil rights movement, there wasn't really a civil rights movement in Atlanta proper, right? And part of that was because of the agreements of the old Atlanta back when it was the sort of a Black, let's say, leadership class, of reverends and so forth, with the white elite who would say, hey, look, we don't want all that civil rights activity here in Atlanta. So you don't bring that here, and we don't bring as much repression. And you know what? When housing is needed, we'll build some housing, dilapidated, but we'll build some housing over in that area of the city, of course. But we're going to obviously build all the good housing over here, which you can't come to anyway and get in, right? But that was the agreement, basically. And then later, when there was the majority of Atlanta was Black, and it was obvious that the death throes of official Jim Crow was right on the table and it was ending, you know, a new agreement took place that the Black political elite could run the city, but it would answer to the white economic elite. And why do we say that? We say that because the proof is, again, as mentioned earlier, Atlanta, under the Black economic elite, under the mayorship of 40 or 50 years, under the majority city council of 40 or 50 years, has gone from a majority Black working class city of 60% to one that is completely gentrifying, whereas the Black population is now under 50% for the first time in like 60 years, 70 years in Atlanta.
Great.
Where the gentrification is so strong
Come
that
on.
only a few working class Black communities left, working class and poor Black communities left in Atlanta, because those folks have been pushed out. When we look at the Olympics and the Black political elite who did their damnedest to get the Olympics here in Atlanta, what did they do? They tore down all public housing. They gave one-way bus tickets to homeless people to leave
right.
Atlanta, right? They built a framework and or a system of vouchers in which landlords could turn down the vouchers, and so therefore they weren't worth the money, the paper they were printed on in terms of being able to pay people's rent. It was under this Black leadership that this has happened and continues to happen, and it is under this leadership that an idea like Stop Cop City can happen. And then, one other very important aspect of what's happening now, this Black elite is also this political elite, right? We have the issue here in Atlanta of Buckhead. Buckhead is the northern economic engine.
They want to be separate.
Yes,
Yeah.
that wants to be separate, right? Even though Buckhead, if you looked at it as an individual city, it would be considered the 12th safest city in the country in terms of so-called crime rates. But still, they tout night and day how the mayor of Atlanta or the city of Atlanta has failed in preventing crime, right? That is their speaking point. That is their talking point. The governor and the mayor have basically teamed up because the governor has said to the mayor, I like how you're handling policing in Atlanta. And so therefore, the Buckhead folks who want to secede from Atlanta, I'm going to make sure that in the legislature, the Republican votes are not going to be there to push this forward. Because basically you're doing a good job. Right?
Wow.
You're doing a good job. So we're going to keep this together.
Law and
Right?
order.
So that is the other tie. Again, this Mayor Dickens would agree with this anyway and ran on this anyway. But the further tie is that the white moneyed elite northern part of Atlanta is running the policing policy for the whole entire city by threatening to leave. And then the relationship that's developed between, again, the governor and the mayor of Atlanta, who has shown no backbone, to be clear, on this issue and others.
Crazy.
So Kamau, what place? Two things. Why is the Israeli Defense Force training them? Two, are we in a space where we can have an effective community oversight board with some teeth in it, right? Like, it doesn't mean anything if there's no accountability measures in place, right? And how do we get our community to, and I say our, I feel like young people really get it, but there's some folks in an older generation that really believe a certain way about public safety. That makes sense. So, and
right?
Yes, right.
They want cops. Yeah.
Yes. So can we kind of get those things to coalesce? But also, is it realistic to have some sort of community oversight board of some kind? Because we know historically the police can't police themselves. Obviously, what happened in Memphis, that you went from the Red Dogs to the Scorpion unit, but yet this is not the only time your Scorpion unit has harassed community members in a predominantly African American city. So,
and I mean, you've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah,
you've seen all the iterations, right, of things that are suggested to people because we're all afraid. I mean, now be clear. I don't care whether we want cops or not, right? Black folk of all ages in our community understand that there is a significant and his century historical problem of how our communities are policed. And yet we find ourselves in a Black city that's supporting something like this. And we also, when you hear phrases like defund the police, folks say, whoa, 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 whoa. Right. So you've seen all iterations, created your own programs, whether it was the cop watches back in New York that we tried to emulate in other communities, right? Like, are these things real? Is the training Are these boards that Ryan described? Like, where are we now? Like, what is
Mhm.
community movement? What are you demanding
Yeah, yeah.
we
So
do in
yeah,
Atlanta and other
yeah.
places?
So, and a couple of things with the quick historical narrative, we look at the police based on their relationship to our community, right? We don't care if a cop is nice to their kids. We don't care if it's a black cop. We don't care if the cop is nice to their partner, if they feed their dog. It's just the system of policing and its historical connection to the black community, which is a connection of oppression. As we know in the South, policing evolved from
Slave
slave
patrols.
patrols,
Yep.
right? So that is the historical antecedents of modern policing, particularly here in the South. And in the North, interesting enough, a lot of the police departments were developed out of suppressing labor movements, right? So
Mhm.
we have this policing force, which is around protecting private property and
Yep.
suppressing particularly black communities. That's the very nature. And so for us, a lot of times, it doesn't matter whether or not the cop is black or white. When they are told to move, they're going to move.
First. Yep.
When
They're
they're
blue
told to
first.
arrest, they're going to arrest. And their
Mhm.
training is such, and their idealism is such in terms of coming with a certain ideology, is that they're trained to control the situation. So when you talk back to a cop, when you have the nerve to express, again, to so-called express your First Amendment rights, or to try to get some information and say like, hey, why am I being stopped? They see that as a challenge
Mhm.
because they're told that they're the biggest gang on the street with these red dog units. In New York, it was the street crimes unit. These are the units that are the let's say the frontal arm or the frontal sword, the tip of the spear of the police, which are meant to be in the community to corral, stop, intimidate, attempting to say that they're on the search for weapons, but they're there to control communities. So we don't, so obviously we don't know, we believe any particular reform is going to solve the issue because we don't believe that the very nature of policing as it takes place in our community is solvable under the system that we have, which is why I'm a radical person, right?
Mhm.
So I believe that of course you do things to bring about some reform changes, a better the body cams, a better civilian complaint review board system. But I think as you're doing that, you do have to do things that are right. What do we do to create a buffer? How
Yeah.
do we create security systems in our community through cop watches and safety walks to create a buffer between our community and the police, right? As we try to challenge these state institutions and build up resources that we can help protect and serve our own communities, not just in policing, but as you were alluding to, we try to do a lot of things in terms of community movement builders, in terms of stabilizing what's
Talk about,
left of the working class black community.
because I think that is what needs to happen, right? Like you talk,
Investment.
what is the self-determining aspect of how we can, because if we're just talking about reform and cameras and new policies and trainings and civilian review boards, then we're still reacting, right, to the oppression that's happening to us. What are those self-determining models that you work so hard to build throughout your career as an attorney, as an activist, and now through your organization here in Atlanta? It's not just in Atlanta, right? Because now
Yeah.
you have grown to other states. Like, what are those self-determining models that communities can adopt to minimize these actions or interactions, with police in their community?
Yeah. The first things we do, we take the historical precedent again of like, what did the Panthers do, right? Because we think those radical movements that were destroyed, they were destroyed because they had answers, right? They were
Mm.
destroyed because they were doing things that were outside the box of what was allowed or told to us we should be doing in terms of having self-determining communities. So having the cop watches and the safety patrols, those are things that we're really serious about. Developing alternatives to who you call, right, when you're in some sort of trouble, in terms of other than calling the police for certain things. We even believe, like, the PAD system is good. Police alternative diversion system here in Atlanta is a decent start to at least something that's reform minded. But it means that when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis or they're homeless, there's another agency that's being called, and they're not folks who are coming out there with guns. So we need to create a buffer, for lack of a better way to say it, security apparatus
Come on.
that acts for our community in the
Mhm.
community,
Mm.
that at some point even the community gets to control and says, look, we want you guys to deploy here, we want you folks to deploy there, because we think, Aunt Betty is scared about going out such and such and such, or somebody needs to talk to these kids about such and such and such. That is our role as community organizers and activists, to find those solutions and then build them to scale, build them to a certain scale where the reproduction of them in other places becomes an obvious thing that we can do and take care of, as opposed to something that looks like, it's so niche or small that we can't do anything beyond having the police from the police department that's controlled by the city and these private corporations come in here and patrol our communities. Because we know in the end, when they patrol our communities, statistics, like I said earlier, where 90% of the arrests that happen in Fulton County, the city that Atlanta is located in, or the county that the city of Atlanta is located in, are Black folks being arrested, right? So we know that that's not a solution for our community. We have to dig deep. We have to build with folks in the community. We have a stabilization fund that we pay for folks to stay in their homes so they can be able to pay utility bills, rent, mortgage. We'll do that once a year per family, up to $750. We're going to increase the amount soon as our budget goes up. But we do that to keep people in their homes. We do mutual aid practice. We're with the community who help us with the distribution of food. They do political education with us. They find other families who are saying they're in need. We develop, we at this point are giving out to 75 families every 2 weeks food and toiletries to help them survive and stay in place. So we think, we don't do single issue stuff. We try to figure out what is happening in terms of surround, I don't want to call them services, but surround needs, right?
Yes.
For our entire community. Because in that way, we can show there's not only a service alternative, but a political alternative.
Yes.
These programs must have their political understanding and backing to say the reason we're doing this is because of what the state is doing, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it because I think people miss, they overlook how all of these things intersect, right? Like Ryan talks about that all the time. And she looks at it through the intersectionality of all these things. And I love how you talk about the stabilization and how your work, right? It's not about making sure somebody eats. That's a byproduct. That's going to happen. But the stabilization of our communities is the primary focus of the work that you are doing, right? And not just the Atlanta area, and specific targeted communities in Atlanta, right? But also in the other places that you are. And we have many questions that we want to ask, but we're coming close to the end. And we want to make sure that people are clear about, when they see or hear community movement builders, is in their community or is in Atlanta, like what are some specific programs you want to share? What are your next steps with Cop City that people can support? How can they support what you're doing, right? Like, how can they support you financially? How can they support you with other resources like time and body and presence? We just want to make sure that people understand the importance of the stabilization work that y'all are doing in Black communities and marginalized communities.
No, thank you for that. And they can go to communitymovementbuilders.org. They can support us there. They can find out more about our programs. They can find out more about our work to stop Cop City. And even though there is a possibility, right, because Capitol is strong, the state is united on building Cop City. So there's a chance it will get built, right? I'm not so much of a radical or believer that I don't understand the power of the state. But we're going to make the state pay a political price for this also, right? And we think through this process of organizing and activism that has happened across political spectrums on the left have been the anchors of stopping Cop City for the last 2 years, that there is now a unity of purpose that we didn't have at the beginning that is keeping us going now. And so we're going to continue to challenge the city. We're going to challenge the fact that the city wants to have the Democratic National Convention here.
Come on.
Let the Democratic National Convention know. If you come to Atlanta, you're going to be protested. Like it's not going to be a cakewalk for you to get your delegation from their bus trips and from the buses and the hotels to the hotel rooms. That's going to be a struggle for you. Atlanta's now vying to get the next World Cup here. If you bring the World Cup here, we're going to let you know that it's going to be an issue. There's going to be direct action. There's going to be demonstrations. That the mayor in particular has to pay a political price for going against the wishes of the larger community. At the time of the vote, 70% of the people who called in said they were opposed to the building of Cop City, but yet the mayor and the city council pushed us forward and did it anyway. And the only reason it wasn't higher is because they had police and fire people calling in on behalf of supporting it. So we're going to keep this struggle going.
And tell people, like Ryan had this question, I want to make sure we get it in. Tell people, right, why they need to be concerned about a cop city in Atlanta. Like, why can it happen in other places, right?
That's
Like, why should they get involved with us now? Why? What's the fear? What's the boogeyman behind, the concept of cop cities?
So Cop City is basically a policing militarized center. So the same way you have military bases, basically this is a policed militarized base in the heart of Atlanta, right adjacent to a working class Black community. And as we stated before, the idea of Cop City comes out of the uprisings of 2020. On this facility, they're going to have a landing pad for a Black Hawk helicopter. They're going to have over a dozen firing ranges, mock cities to practice crowd control, to practice stopping mobilizations, a place where they can detonate explosives. So this is a training center where not only are they going to be having Atlanta police, but from their own documents, again, through Freedom of Information Acts, we've discovered that 43% of the officers of the police who are going to be trained at Cop City are going to be outside of Georgia.
So these are war games.
Exactly. This is a national training center. And you brought up the idea of the aspect of the Israeli police. There's already a program, right? And this is happening in different cities, but here in Georgia, it's called GILLI. I think it's the Georgia Law Enforcement Training Association. It's housed at Georgia State. This center is basically where the Israeli police train Georgia police, including Atlanta police, in tactics and strategies. And so the same tactics and strategies that the Israelis use to suppress Palestinians are being brought here to be used against the Black community. And the same tactics and strategies used against the Black community are being exported to the Palestinian community in Palestine. This is the beginning of a nationalization concept of policing in terms of strategies and tactics. Again, not only to continue the suppression of poor and working class Black communities, but to be ready and on guard to stop movement activities as they develop. Remember, movement activities against police violence and other things also,
social
but
media
against
surveillance.
It's all there. Yeah, it's all going to be there.
Yeah.
This is not just some simple, hey, we're going to have a training center. They state even in their own records about their training center now that it's a paramilitary training center. So what is this center going to be? That's going to be over 300 acres in forest taken to build this thing out.
So it's like a la Daryl Gates and William H. Parker, basically, but on steroids.
It's not okay.
So I'm going to bring in a special guest. We're having a robust conversation, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring in our very own Cliff Albright, co-founder, executive director of Black Voters Matter. Welcome, Cliff. The conversation's getting good.
You see the car?
In nature, looks like.
No, I'm not in the car. Ryan says we're having a robust conversation, but I'm gonna bring in Cliff as if the robust conversation is about
for comedy relief. She said for comedy relief.
Right, comedy relief. Thank y'all for coming. God bless. Good night. I'm really glad to be on here. In all seriousness, with my good friend, longtime comrade Kamau. Who y'all been listening, and for those that might be joining in late, of course, we're talking about Cop City, Stop Cop City. We're talking about the organizing that's been going on for a long time, even before the murder of Tort, and we're talking about what we can do, right? Which brings me to one of the questions that we got from our audience. And again, thank you to everybody who's been tuning in and listening. It's not too late if you're listening right now and you got a friend who needs this information. Go on and hit them up, right? Tag them, text her, call somebody up, tell them that they need to tune in for these last few minutes, because we still got a few more gems, I think, coming your way, coming from Kamau. But I wanted to touch on one of the questions that we got from the audience, because it said, what can we do to protect ourselves if Cop City is moving forward, right? And I think there's a couple of dimensions to that question, but the one that I really want us to address, and maybe Kamau you can speak to, is, I want to push back against the question, because I don't ever presume or assume that we can't stop a thing, right? In fact, as organizers, Kamau knows that we are often in the business of making possible that which other people like to think is impossible. And so, what is it that we can still do to stop Cop City, right? Because as you've said, the movement has grown in the months from when it first started, right? And I think it's important that we just kind of do a level set to say, look, this movement is not getting weaker, it's getting stronger, and there's still a way that we can stop Cop City. And so if you could just speak to that for a second.
And and some of the critical things that have happened recently that are really important to hold up is that students have started to organize and get involved. And not just any students on AUC campus, right? Students at Morehouse and Spelman, Georgia Tech, Emory, Georgia State. These students have started to take hold and make this their issue. And there's real, there's real power in that hasn't been tapped before. So much power that Mayor Dinkins, and I keep almost calling him Dinkins as in New York because I'm old like that. Or Mayor Dinkins from Atlanta called for, he doesn't like to say that he called for it, but called for an emergency meeting at Morehouse to talk to the young people to try to get them back in line. So we know that the power of the organizing and activism that is happening in the streets is strong, and it is something that can move people. So folks, we're doing multiple weeks of actions that are coming up in terms of the larger decentralized movement to stop Cop City. I just dropped in the private chat, and I'm hoping somebody can move it to the public chat, things, not only demands, but actions that folks can take around the country. Those things include, we want to get to the corporations. We've had different corporations dropped out. We've worked with Color of Change to put pressure on those corporations. If we can get those corporations to drop out, that dries up the money. The developers who are actually building this project, we've had developers dropped out already. We can continue to get to those developers and tell them that they will have no peace if they continue to be the developers to build this. Then that will be something that will help stop Cop City. As mentioned a few minutes ago, if we start to target these large institutions that are talking about coming to Atlanta, if Atlanta suffers economically as it sees it, then that is something that can help stop Cop City. March 9th, we're doing a major protest. We're about to release the flyer. Black Voters Matters has been one of the endorsers of that protest. And that's something in which we want to kill the narrative that the mayor has been trying to put out, that this is a white out-of-town movement. The mayor, the police chief has said outside agitators are coming to Atlanta to disrupt things. And when I hear that language, I hear the language, it's the language of Southern segregationists.
Yes.
They've adopted the language, the historical language that
Wallace.
was used against King himself when
That's
King
right.
traveled and called an outside agitator. So we want to dismiss that notion that Black organizations, everyday Black folks, Black groups are not involved in this struggle. And March 9th is our way of saying that we want you to understand that this is a struggle which we are united on, that folks from different parts of the movement are coming around together to gather together to march to let you know that there will be no peace in Atlanta if you decide to continue to move forward and build Cop City.
You mentioned, and I think we got another question that we're going to try to get to. We're right at 7 o'clock, so we're going to try to be respectful of everybody's time, but we're going to try to squeeze in one or two more.
Started late, so we started late. We started at 7. Yeah, so we got about 10 more minutes. So
There is an audience
Perfect.
question around whether the goal is abolition or not, too. I don't want to miss that question.
Okay. Let me ask this before we get to that, because I think Kamau kind of touched on the whole issue of reform, but we can follow up on that. But I wanted to ask this because you just mentioned, and you mentioned earlier the corporate support, and forgive me if I missed it earlier, because within those corporations, right, is a corporation which is actually one of the media corporation which owns a lot of the major media in Atlanta. And so you talked about narrative shift. A lot of the way that the narrative has been formed is because that you've got these subsidiaries of Cox, like the AJC itself, who has been reporting on an issue which their parent company is heavily invested in. Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah. So, I mean, you nailed it on the head. Cox Enterprises is a supporter and the largest donor to build Cop City. And in their newspaper, they've been like 6 or 7 editorials all about the need to build Cop City and all about criminalizing protests against Cop City. And they don't expose, when they do that they are a funder of this particular project. And so that media narrative of driving home that there's now this idea of like we've gone from defunding and abolish the police as stated to now that there's a crime wave that has to be resolved and solved. And the only way to do that is to build this training center, which is ridiculous on its face, right? A training center that won't be built, even if there wasn't any protests, for 4 or 5 years, has nothing to do with public safety whatsoever. So the idea that the media, the local media, but particularly the Cox Company, is funding this and at the same time is driving a narrative about the need for it is a further implication of how the elite forces gather around each other and support each other when it wants to push through things they see as in their interest.
Right. Thank you for that. And then the question that Ryan mentioned, is the goal abolition? You talked a little bit about this in terms of talking about the limitations of reform and how we've got to have this bigger vision of like what community safety. It's not about policing, right? It's about safety and having a different vision on what safety looks like. But in your minds, community movement builders, what is the goal? Is the goal abolition or what?
And don't be scared, folks. I mean, I know you hear the word abolition, right? And people get scared. And we oftentimes forget historically the abolition movement, right, was technically, and I do use the word technically with quotes, was that which quote unquote abolished slavery. So, we can't, as a people in particular, be afraid to hear the word abolishment or abolition, because it is very important part, of our history of struggle here in this country. But I just wanted to say that because I know people immediately hear that, they start,
And I'm gonna get them even more frightened because I'm gonna go a step further than abolition in terms of the policy I don't practice. So, again, because of the nature of what the police are, I don't believe that the state, i.e. the city, the state or whatever, will ever abolish its public police force, because it's the use of the public police force that it controls populations, movements, labor movements, organizing movements. So when we talk about abolition, we got to start with abolishing the state itself, right? Moving and changing the very nature of how the state operates. So if we don't seize the apparatus of city government and state government through people who come from our movements, right? So one of my big things, we joked earlier around my position on voting and so forth. I'm down with voting as a strategy within a larger movement, and one that puts forth our people who come from our movements with the backing of those movements, at the very least, to attempt to change how resources are distributed, where we live in a city now where over 30, 40, 50% of the resources are given to policing agencies, right? Where, again, there's not been any affordable housing built in Atlanta via the city in over 20 years. And all the new private funding for housing is luxury housing, right? So these are priorities that people have given and stated and have enacted. And so as opposed to serving the needs of poor working class Black people, they have pushed those folks out. They have lost whatever legacy of representation politics they ever had to say that they are a part of our community and looking for the better part of our community. These political elites, who are more tied to the corporate governance structure of Atlanta and writ large any major city and in national structures, have basically served their time and need to be replaced. They need to be replaced with something that's stronger, that's more rash, that's more radical, that's about the self-determination of our communities and our peoples. And those are the goals that guide like organizers like us in terms of the work that we do. Obviously, it's a process, but we can't think that we're going to break the back of the way in which policing happens in our community until we go after those very systems that control how police are used in our communities.
That's amazing. Like, that's a succinct, amazing response to that. And again, we can't be afraid of that, right? Because we are trying to be safe. We're trying to be whole. And even as we are changing things radically, it doesn't mean that we have to, that goal has to be extracted from this new creation that we are imagining and we're working to do. So, we just gotta, we've always been a courageous people. We've just got to continue to be those courageous people. But we are at the hour mark now. Cliff, did you have, any other questions that you want to share, from the audience or from our discussion, or, and Ryan after Cliff?
No, I think Kamau's last remarks were a good place to leave it. I will add this real quick. I want to encourage people, as we're talking about like reimagining safety, right? Not just reimagining policing, but reimagining safety. I've been telling people about a book that I read, past couple of weeks called American Sirens. And it's about the first paramedics. And most people don't know that, like, within a lifetime, like literally within my lifetime, right? Maybe not some of our younger watchers' lifetimes, but within the past 55 years or so, if you go back 55 years, when you used to call up for an ambulance or when there was a medical emergency, you wouldn't get somebody who was a paramedic coming to deliver, first aid, CPR, right, tourniquet, whatever. You wouldn't get that. Like literally what you would get is some people whose only job was to put the body into a vehicle and then take it to the hospital. Absolutely no medical service would take place between the time that they arrived, right, until the time they got to the hospital. The first paramedics were from a community center called Freedom House in Pittsburgh, and it was all Black folks. The first paramedics, before there was any kind of training, any kind of manual, nothing.
Black History Month facts.
That's right, Black History Month. And so, we have come to now where, like, we think, oh, you call 911, you get this, and we think that that's the only way it's ever been, right? And so you can't even reimagine something because you think it's always been this way, when in truth, it's only been this way just for our lifetimes, which ain't that long. And so when we talk about reimagining what safety can look like, we got to know that within our lifetimes have come from a point where safety was something completely different, where Black folks transformed it to the point where the entire country wound up taking up paramedic services in cities and states all across the country. We did that. We did that. Also reimagine what safety looks like today. It does not have to be what we think it's always been.
So,
Ryan, follow that. You always do this to me, Cliff.
I'm out. I'll see y'all later.
This was actually an audience question that I was curious about. I know that
I think we're at our hour. We
gotta stop.
And we don't want to lose our guest. So.
Okay. I tried team.
No, but get it in real quick. Get it in.
So is it realistic to expect political involvement, elected involvement? Because so many people are so worried about their jobs, they're winning the next election, that doing the work becomes less of a priority. Is basically the question that was asked.
I mean, if I understand the question correctly, is it that folks work so hard to get somebody in office, or the person in office?
The person in office seems more concerned about the next election, putting off the work. Is there a way to get electeds involved where?
Well, that's the problem. Yeah.
I'm a person that's like, that's the risk you take being an elected official. You might lose some people, right? But this gentleman asked, is there a way to get electeds involved that doesn't pose such a risk to their positions?
Well, the direct answer is going to be no, right? Because part of the problem is that the elected officials, they don't think they have an ideology, most of them, right? Some of them don't think they're an ideologue or whatever. But they're entering these fields with certain ideological positions, which for them, almost like as Cliff is talking about, they swim in that water. For them, development means putting buildings up, shiny, brand new buildings, and if something is old, it needs to be replaced and thrown out. To them, development is bigger corporate headquarters, having big stadiums in cities, and they see that as the prize, right? And if they see something that is old or worn, there's not an idea of like development means how do you fix that up, or how do you give communities what they need? How do you keep people in their place? For them, development means replacing poor people with middle class people. So there's an ideological point of view that these folks come at it with. And that includes policing, that the police are there to, in their understanding of it, they think they're not being ideological again, but for them, policing are there to serve a particular purpose, which is not only to protect what I would say private property, but they do earnestly think that they're stopping crime. And you can put up stats in front of them. You can show them the dent in crime that the police have anything really to do about, right? Because they're report writers after something takes place. This is not a public safety apparatus. They're not stopping these incidents from happening, but they're so imbued with this ideology. Solving problems of homelessness is not about building places where folks who are houseless can live. It's about, how do I get them out of my city, right? There's these ideological frameworks that these folks come into these positions with. And again, it's not even easy to get somebody who has the positions that you think they should have always to do the things that you want them to do. But at least you have a better chance when you have movement activity that is surrounding these people and organizing with these people to keep them in check. At the same time, you have someone with a similar ideological vision around what self-determination and organizing means, right? And I think there's a large issue around, again, with these political elites, particularly since the time of Obama, where the sky became the limit. Right? I'm not talking particularly about black elites. At one point, being a mayor was the biggest you could do, and then maybe it might be a senator. But once sort of Obama broke through and became a president, for black political elites who are even less tied to the actual black community, although they had in their tool belt the rhetoric of what it meant to talk for the black community, for them, it was the sky is the limit. And again, the time spent raising money, as you suggested, of putting forth campaigns, of getting to that next office, of doing something else that keeps them moving and shaking and going, is far more important to them than what do they do about real public safety? What do they do about resources to poor and working class communities? Those are abstracts to them. For them, the real things are the political careerism that drives them forward.
Yeah, this is and all and this has been a rich discussion. We've been we're over our mark here, so we're going to close out. But we policy corner for Black Voters Matter is where policy meets action. We believe that direct action is what that has been our legacy, right? That's been the legacy of Black folk in this country, and so we were so glad to have you tonight. Anything you want to leave us with about? We have your organization's information up on the screen, and we've had it up for some time, but we'll let you be our parting words.
I mean, the only thing I would say in parting is that for the folks who work for Black Voters Matter and other people who are, I guess, connected to the organization, y'all have to realize that y'all have some real important people in terms of the legacy of Black struggle who started this organization and are running this organization. And I may kid a lot, but April and Cliff, maybe, I don't know if they can say this publicly anymore, but are revolutionaries. These are people who come from and they've built something, right, that is about, as they say, power building, as you say, power building. And these are people who have politics that folks need to sit down and learn from and understand that there's plans underway, and that your organization that you are with is something that you need to understand has some real plans for power building. And these are folks who come from the actual movement struggle, the radical movement struggle, which this country has tried to supplant. And these are real people who are real movement people. And so I always want to celebrate and uplift you and say it publicly, because I don't always get to talk to you as much as I would like to, but I love and I care for you guys deeply. And I really thank you for any and all support that you've always given me during this time period of our lives together.
We love you, brother. We're so glad that you're on our board. And Latasha, if she was here, she would give you a black fist too. But our sister is, tending to her heart,
I understand.
And we just give her honor tonight too, just by saying that we trying to, what is it, Cliff? Radically reimagine, how we are going to move about and build power in this country. So we love you. We honor you. We love the work you're doing. We always want to be down and feel like Cliff, Ryan, we was on here with Brother Kwame tonight. I just, having those entrenched conversations that we need to have, not just about this one issue, but about how they all intersect. So Cliff, you can Russell Simmons us out tonight.
She's so crazy. Thank y'all for coming. This is part of our Black History Month series, because this work that Kamau was talking about, the community movement builders does, is very consistent with our history. It's consistent with the history of the Panthers, and not just in the sense of being trying to deal with safety from the police, but also in regards to all the other things that Kamau talked about: self-determination and taking care of ourselves and feeding ourselves and housing ourselves. So with that said, I will end it just by saying, always remember, y'all, that in spite of everything that we're going through, that Black voters matter 365, and we won't black down.